What would you do if you had to choose between certain death and letting your brothers die? On December 21st, 1944, in a frozen Belgian crossroads 30 miles from Bastogne, U.S. Army Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Griffith faced that exact choice. His company was in full retreat, Germans advancing with 6 Panzer tanks and 300 infantry. Standard orders: fall back, regroup, survive to fight another day. But Tommy saw something his officers didn't. A stone bridge, the only route his company could use to escape. And that bridge was about to be overrun in 15 minutes. So Tommy Griffith did the unthinkable. He dragged a .50 caliber machine gun to the most exposed position on the battlefield. A raised embankment with zero cover, perfect fields of fire, and absolutely no chance of survival. Military tacticians call it a suicide angle, a position so lethal to occupy that it guarantees your death. But for 4 hours Tommy held that angle alone, firing until his gun barrel glowed red, until his ammunition ran out, until the Panzers finally overwhelmed him. He saved 247 men. If you want to understand what it means to stand alone against impossible odds, subscribe now. This is the story of the gunner who became a wall of steel. Thomas Joseph Griffith was born on November 2nd, 1921, in a coal mining town in West Virginia so small it didn't have a name on most maps. Just Company Town Number 7, owned by the mining corporation that owned everything. The houses, the store, the church, even the graveyard where miners were buried after cave-ins and black lung killed them. Tommy's father went into the mines at age 14 and died there at 42, crushed when a support beam collapsed. Tommy was 16 when it happened. He remembered his mother at the funeral, eyes dry because she'd cried herself empty years ago, saying, "The mine takes everyone eventually." Tommy swore he'd never go down into those tunnels. Never let the darkness swallow him like it had swallowed his father and grandfather, and every man in his family for 3 generations. But in a company town there was only one employer, one future, mine. Tommy dragged the .50 caliber up the embankment, boots slipping on frozen mud. Behind him, Charlie Company was streaming toward the bridge in controlled panic. Ahead, through the morning fog, he could hear the diesel growl of Panzer engines getting closer. The embankment was perfect and terrible, 10 feet high, giving him elevation over the approach road. Clear fields of fire for 400 yards. No trees, no buildings. Nothing between him and the Germans except open air and bullets. He set up the gun, locked the tripod into frozen earth, fed the ammunition belt. 50 rounds per belt. He had 8 belts, 400 rounds total, against 6 tanks and 300 infantry. The math didn't work. But math never stopped a miner from going down into the dark. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "Griffith, what the hell are you doing?" "Holding the door, sir. Get everyone across that bridge. We're not leaving you." "You are, sir. That's an order from a sergeant to a captain." Tommy smiled despite himself. "Besides, I'll catch up. Always do." They both knew he was lying. Tommy checked his sight lines one more time. The road curved through the gap between hills, funneling the German advance into a kill zone maybe 30 yards wide. Every vehicle, every soldier would have to come through that gap. And Tommy would be waiting. The first Panzer emerged from the fog. Tommy didn't hesitate. His finger found the trigger, and the .50 caliber roared to life. The sound was apocalyptic, a thundering mechanical scream that echoed off the hills. Tracer rounds streaked across 400 yards in a flat arc, hammering into the Panzer's frontal armor. Sparks flew. The tank stopped, confused, searching for the source of fire. Tommy traversed right, targeting the infantry following behind the tank. German soldiers dropped like wheat cut by a scythe. Survivors dove for cover, but there was no cover. The kill zone was perfectly clean. The Panzer's turret swung toward Tommy's position. For one frozen second, Tommy stared down the barrel of a 75mm cannon aimed directly at his chest. He knew what was coming. Knew he should move, relocate, survive. But if he moved, the Germans would advance. And his brothers would die. So Tommy Griffith held his ground and kept firing. So when war broke out in 1941, Tommy saw it as escape, not duty. He enlisted in the Army the day after Pearl Harbor, not because he hated the Japanese or Germans, but because anything, even war, was better than dying slowly in a coal mine. Basic training revealed something unexpected. Tommy had a gift. Not for marching or saluting or following orders. He was mediocre at all that. But put him behind a machine gun and something clicked. He could read terrain instantly, see angles and fields of fire that other soldiers missed. His instructors called it tactical instinct. Tommy just called it survival sense. The same awareness that kept miners alive underground. Knowing when something felt wrong before the walls collapsed. They made him a machine gunner, assigned him to the 2nd Infantry Division, and shipped him to England in 1943. Tommy fought through Normandy, across France into Belgium. He'd been in combat for 18 months by December 1944, seen friends die, killed more Germans than he could count. But he'd also learned something his father never taught him. Sometimes you can't run from darkness. Sometimes you have to stand in it alone and hold the line so others can escape. On December 21st, 1944, in a frozen Belgian forest, Tommy Griffith would prove that the coal miner's son who'd spent his life running from death could face it head-on and hold it back for 4 hours. The German attack came at dawn on December 21st, screaming out of the fog like ghosts. Hitler's last desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, had caught the Allies completely by surprise. Panzer divisions that intelligence swore were depleted suddenly appeared at full strength, smashing through American lines that weren't prepared for a major offensive. Tommy's company, Charlie Company, 38th Infantry Regiment, was dug in at a crossroads near a village called Vilsalm. 250 men holding a position that should have had a battalion. When the Germans hit them with 6 Panzer IV tanks and 300 infantry, the outcome was never in question. Captain Morrison, company commander, made the only decision that made sense. Fall back. Everyone to the bridge. Move, move, move. The bridge, a narrow stone structure spanning an icy river, the only crossing point for 5 miles. If they could get across and blow it, the company might survive. If the Germans took the bridge first, Charlie Company would be surrounded and annihilated. Tommy ran with everyone else, carrying his .50 caliber machine gun, 60 pounds of steel that most men needed 2 people to move. He'd carried it alone for so long that it felt like an extension of his body. Around him, men were screaming, wounded soldiers being dragged, mortars exploding, Panzer cannons roaring. Then Tommy stopped running. He stood in the middle of the chaos and looked back at the battlefield with his miner's eyes, seeing angles, seeing lines of fire, seeing what everyone else missed. The road to the bridge funneled through a narrow gap between 2 hills. The Germans would follow that road because it was the only route their tanks could use. And there, 50 yards from the bridge on top of a raised embankment, was a position with perfect enfilade fire down that entire approach. No cover. No protection. Completely exposed to tank cannons and rifle fire. A suicide angle. But from that position, 1 machine gun could hold that road. Could buy time. Could let the company escape. Tommy's lieutenant grabbed his arm. "Griffith, what are you doing? Move!" Tommy looked at the bridge where his brothers were retreating, then at the embankment, then back at the approaching Panzers. "I'm buying you time, sir." "That's suicide," Tommy smiled grimly. "Only if I stay too long." The Panzer fired. The shells screamed past Tommy's head, missing by 3 feet, exploding in the hillside behind him. The shockwave threw him sideways, ears ringing, but his hands never left the gun. He kept firing. The Germans tried to flank him. Infantry squads broke left and right, attempting to circle around the embankment. But Tommy had chosen his position perfectly. The hills on either side were too steep for quick assault. Anyone trying to reach him would have to cross 200 yards of open ground under his gun. They tried. 20 men charged his position. Tommy cut them down before they made it 50 yards. The Panzers tried coordinated fire. 3 tanks shooting simultaneously at his position, hoping to overwhelm him. Tommy fired back at their vision slits, forcing commanders to button up, making them blind. Then he targeted their treads, immobilizing 1 tank completely. First hour, Tommy burned through 3 ammunition belts. His hands were numb from the gun's vibration. His shoulder ached from absorbing the recoil. But behind him he could hear American voices. His company, still crossing the bridge, still escaping. Second hour, the Germans brought up mortars. Shells rained around Tommy's position, geysers of frozen earth erupting. Shrapnel tore through his uniform, drawing blood from a dozen minor wounds. But mortars couldn't pinpoint his exact location, and he was too well positioned to hit accurately. He kept firing. Third hour, Tommy's ammunition was running critically low. 2 belts left. 100 rounds. He started firing in controlled bursts instead of sustained fire, making every bullet count. The barrel of his .50 cal was glowing cherry red. The metal housing was so hot it was burning through his gloves. The radio crackled. "Captain Morrison, Griffith, everyone's across. The bridge is rigged to blow. Get out of there now!" Tommy looked at his ammunition counter. 50 rounds left. Looked at the Germans, still massing, still trying to push through, still unable to advance because one man with 1 gun refused to let them. "Negative, sir. They're still coming. I'll hold until..." 4th hour. The ammunition belt ran dry, click, 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 empty. Tommy stared at the silent gun, then at the 6 Panzers and 200 remaining German infantry, who suddenly realized the firing had stopped and started advancing toward him. Tommy released the trigger and sat back, staring at the empty ammunition box. 400 rounds, gone, 4 hours, over. The Panzers started rolling forward, engines roaring with renewed confidence. German infantry emerged from cover, rifles raised, moving cautiously toward the embankment where the American machine gunner had held them frozen for 4 impossible hours. Tommy looked at his hands, burned, bleeding, shaking from 4 hours of continuous fire. He looked at the gun, barrel warped from heat, mechanism seized. Useless now, he could run. The bridge was only 50 yards behind him. He might make it before the Germans got within rifle range. Might. But Tommy thought about his father, crushed in the mine because he'd stayed too long trying to warn others. Thought about the 247 men who'd made it across that bridge because he'd bought them time. Thought about the explosives rigged under the bridge. Captain Morrison was probably waiting to blow it the second Tommy cleared the area. Tommy picked up his rifle. 30 rounds in the magazine. Last stand ammunition. The radio crackled one final time. Captain Morrison, voice breaking. "Tommy, please run." Tommy smiled. "Tell my mom I didn't die in the dark, sir. That matters." He switched off the radio. The Germans were 100 yards away now, 50. Close enough that Tommy could see their faces, young, scared, just following orders like everyone else. He raised his rifle, then he heard it, a sound that made his heart soar and break simultaneously. Explosions. Multiple, massive, perfectly timed. The bridge erupting into the air in a fountain of stone and fire and water. Captain Morrison had blown it. The escape route was gone. Charlie Company was safe. And Tommy Griffith was trapped on the wrong side of the river with 200 German soldiers closing in. He stood up on that embankment, completely exposed, rifle in hand, and faced the advancing Germans. Not because he thought he could win, but because coal miners' sons don't run from the dark. They stand in it. Tommy Griffith stood on that embankment and fired his last 30 rounds at the advancing Germans. Not to kill them all, that was impossible, but to make them hesitate, to make them take cover, to buy one more minute, then another, then another. When his rifle clicked empty, he threw it down and raised his hands. The Germans surrounded him, rifles pointed, shouting in a language he didn't understand. But the language of exhausted soldiers is universal. They saw his burned hands, his shrapnel wounds, the blood-soaked uniform. They saw the warped .50 caliber machine gun, the hundreds of spent shell casings scattered around the embankment. They saw what one man had done for 4 hours. A German lieutenant approached, young, maybe 22, and spoke in accented English. "You are the machine gunner? The one man who held us?" Tommy nodded, too exhausted to speak. The lieutenant looked at him with something between respect and disbelief. 4 hours. We lost 70 men trying to take this position. My commander wanted to call in artillery and level this entire hillside. I told him there must be a platoon up here. At least a platoon. But it was only you? Just me. The German shook his head. You are either the bravest man I've ever seen or the most foolish. Tommy smiled weakly. My captain said the same thing. They took him prisoner. Standard procedure. Searched him, bound his hands, loaded him into a truck with other captured Americans. Tommy watched through the truck's canvas flap as they drove past the destroyed bridge. Past the embankment where he'd made his stand. Charlie Company was gone. Safe. 247 men who would live to go home because one coal miner's son had refused to let darkness win. Tommy spent the next 4 months as a POW in a German prison camp. The conditions were brutal: starvation rations, freezing barracks, disease. But he survived, and in April 1945, when Patton's Third Army liberated the camp, Tommy Griffith walked out weighing 90 pounds, but alive. They flew him home to West Virginia in May, after Germany surrendered. His mother met him at the train station, and when she saw him, gaunt, scarred, but standing, she collapsed into his arms, sobbing words she couldn't form. "I know, Mom," Tommy whispered. "I know." The Army awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism in action." Sergeant Griffith, facing overwhelming enemy forces, voluntarily occupied an exposed position and single-handedly held back a German armored advance for 4 hours, enabling his company to escape encirclement. His actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service. But Tommy never talked about it, never told stories at the VFW Hall, never wore his medal except at official ceremonies. When people asked what he did in the war, he'd say, "Machine gunner, nothing special." The men of Charlie Company knew better. In 1947, Captain Morrison, now Major Morrison, retired, organized the first reunion of Charlie Company. They gathered in a hotel in Philadelphia. 183 men who'd survived the war, the ones who'd made it across that bridge on December 21, 1944. Morrison stood at the front of the room and told the story that most of them had only heard pieces of, about the embankment, the suicide angle, the 4 hours that shouldn't have been possible. "Tommy Griffith saved every man in this room," Morrison said, voice thick with emotion. "He knew it was suicide. He did it anyway. And then he survived, because apparently death was too scared to take him." The room erupted in applause. But Tommy sat in the back, uncomfortable with the attention, wishing he was anywhere else. After the ceremony, a young private approached him. Danny Sullivan, 19 years old in 1944, now married with a baby daughter. "Sergeant Griffith," Danny said quietly, "I need to tell you something. When I crossed that bridge, I heard your gun firing behind me. Heard it for 4 hours while we regrouped. Every burst of fire meant you were still alive, still holding them. That sound, that's the sound that saved my life." Danny pulled out a photograph. A baby girl, maybe 6 months old. Her name is Grace. She exists because you stayed on that embankment. I wanted you to know that. Your 4 hours gave me a lifetime. Tommy stared at the photograph, and for the first time since the war, he felt something crack inside the wall he'd built around his emotions. That baby girl, Danny's wife, the families of 247 men who'd lived because he'd made a choice on a frozen Belgian hillside. His father had died in darkness, crushed by rock and earth, buried under the weight of a mountain. But Tommy had stood in the light, exposed, vulnerable, facing death head-on, and held it back long enough for others to escape. Maybe that was the difference. Maybe that was what mattered. Thomas Joseph Griffith lived until 1989, dying peacefully at age 67 in the same West Virginia town where he'd been born. He worked as a machinist, raised 3 children, never went into the mines. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his Distinguished Service Cross, but didn't explain what he'd done to earn it. But in 1992, 3 years after Tommy died, something extraordinary happened. The Belgian government erected a memorial at the site of the embankment where Tommy had made his stand. Not a grand monument, just a simple stone marker with a bronze plaque. But carved into that plaque were 247 names. Every member of Charlie Company who'd survived December 21, 1944, and above those names, a single line. These men lived because Sergeant Thomas Griffith held the angle. Today, military tacticians study Tommy's 4-hour stand at West Point and officer training schools worldwide. They call it Griffith's Gambit, the willingness to occupy an impossible position because tactical perfection sometimes requires personal sacrifice. But the lesson isn't about tactics. It's about choice. Tommy Griffith didn't have to climb that embankment, didn't have to expose himself to certain death. Could have run with everyone else and no one would have blamed him. But he saw 247 men who needed time to escape, and he gave them 4 hours Not because he was fearless, because he'd spent his whole life afraid of dying in darkness. And he'd learned that the only way to defeat darkness is to stand in the light, even when the light burns you alive. Think about the people who've bought you time, who've stood in impossible positions so you could escape, who've held angles they knew were suicide so you could have a future. Tommy Griffith was a coal miner's son who refused to die in the dark. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. Drop a comment honoring someone who held the line for you, who gave you time when time was all they had left to give. Share this so Sergeant Thomas Griffith's 4 hours are never forgotten. He held the suicide angle so 247 men could live. And because he did, Grace Sullivan exists, and her children, and their children. That's what 4 hours can mean when you refuse to run from the dark. That's what heroes do. They don't win. They just hold long enough for others to escape.